I'm going to share my screen right away, and you should be able to see that now. Designing games that transform players is the name of the talk, and I am Trevin York, and I'm a transformational game designer. And when I say transformational, I am referring to Sabrina Solba's definition of transformational games, that they are those games developed with the intention of changing players in a specific way that transfers and persists beyond the game. That's my favorite way to describe what I do. It's my favorite way to describe what we do. And I really mean we, right? You're here because you've given some of your time and attention to the Green Game Jam. Many of you are in the process of adapting your game to make a lasting positive impact that carries over the real world. So right now, you're all transformational game designers too, and I'm really excited to be here with you all. The reason I'm here specifically with you today is that I have some experiences to share that I think might be useful to your efforts, lessons that I've learned during my career spent designing and developing games that transform players. To be clear and upfront, I am not an academic, and I say that with the utmost respect for academics. Basically, I can't give you an overview of the landscape of transformational game efforts. I simply have been and continue to be hungry to learn and read and play and discover how games might continue to be this powerful and empowering avenue through which to make a lasting positive impact. I am excited to get to see some of the other workshops that are running as part of the Green Game Jam and learn alongside you. Meanwhile, though, I've been incredibly lucky to make a career about putting this learning into practice. For a decade now, I've been the lead game designer at a company called Mindblown Labs. Mindblown is built on the premise that we can make a positive, lasting impact through games and other engaging experiences. And for the first little while working on these projects, I often struggled and I failed. I was often overwhelmed by the problems in front of us. But then we learned and we applied those lessons going forward, and each project became successful a little more quickly. So this stuff works. And I'll give you a quick few examples as evidence really quickly. One of our first projects was an original mobile game designed to teach teens and young adults about personal finance. And it took some time for us to get it right, but in the end, it changed both attitudes and financial behaviors. In fact, it caught the eye of the US Treasury Department, and they sponsored an independent evaluation, which confirmed we were having an impact, which is really exciting. And more recently, we made a game to help get young adults investing for retirement. We've run several pilots, and the results have been very promising so far. This last summer, we launched a virtual summer camp to teach kids and young adults about financial fundamentals and how to responsibly, confidently invest. Our initial sample size is still admittedly very small, but the feedback again is really good. I also consult with various organizations to bring transformational game design techniques and processes to projects aiming for impact in a variety of contexts. So right now, for example, I'm working on one game that inspires kids in underserved communities to actively pursue careers in STEM to show them that it's possible. And another game that empowers young kids so that they might not lose their family in unfamiliar crowds. So my point for sharing all of these projects is that in all of these projects, we're designing to address specific problems in the context of specific communities, and they're specially designed to be successful in those contexts. But along the way, I've also found some approaches, some truths that have been consistent across all of these efforts, pathways to change that keep being relevant in all of these contexts. Because whether the subject is finance or STEM, or the context is healthcare or the climate crisis, in all of these situations, we still need to meaningfully connect with people. So that's why I'm here today. I'm here to share my experience in case any of it is relevant to your efforts. If I want to shift attitudes, if I want to nudge behaviors, or even meaningfully impart knowledge that serves as a foundation to behavior change, I've found 3 approaches that work fairly consistently. And here's what they are. We can design to connect emotionally, to shape identity, and to build trust. That's it. Those are my approaches. These are my touchstones, my guiding lights. All the work I've done essentially boils down to those. So today I'm going to talk to you about what these approaches look like, how I arrived at them, and how I design for them. And then at the end, I promise there will be plenty of time left for questions. So yeah, if you think of any questions along the way, jot it down. At the end, I promise we'll have time to get to that. A deep dive, this is not what I'm doing. We don't have time to deep dive into all of those three. So this will be like the opposite of a deep dive, like zoomed out, really zoomed out orientation. My hope is that something here resonates as being relevant to your efforts, appropriate for your game, appropriate for your players, appropriate for the type of impact you're aiming to have. Because of course, again, that's what matters to us all in the end, right? What specifically is going to be different about your players after the experience? When we design transformational games, we design for the experience after our players have played our game. So a statement might be something like, after playing this game, players will open a savings account. Players will realize a career in STEM is possible for the first time. Players will commit to voting for climate action policies. Players will plant a tree. Emotions, identity, and trust are the potential on-ramps that bring players from the people they are now to the versions of themselves we hope they become. So seriously, right now, imagine your players, imagine the people you're going to help them become. Imagine how your game is going to offer a path that brings them there. Like, take a moment, have that image locked in your head, and then let's go forward and let's find that path together. So here's path one, connecting emotionally. I want to illustrate how important this can be. So I'm going to tell a story about what happens during design efforts when we forget to connect emotionally, and then tell a story about the impact we can have when we remember again. So a few years ago, a major not-for-profit financial institution who provides retirement investments came to Mindblown Labs with a problem. Young adults with access to retirement investment accounts like 401ks, they had access, they weren't touching them. They weren't, or maybe they were contributing tiny amounts. This was and is a major problem in the United States because retirement investments only work because of compound growth over time. Really simply, a 21-year-old who starts investing $100 a month will have more saved at retirement than someone who starts saving $1,000 a month at age 50. That's the nature of how this works. It's always better to start saving today and always much exponentially harder to catch up in the future. So this financial institution felt they could help improve people's lives long-term by sparking a specific change to get people who weren't investing for long-term savings and to get them to start today. And this financial institution had tried a lot of things in pursuit of bringing this change about. It made fancy websites with really, honestly, really pretty calculators showing how money grows over time. It had cool glossaries for every definition. They offered licensed financial advisors for free, professionals who were ready and waiting to answer your every question. They made financial knowledge as accessible as they could, and they tried to overwhelm their audience with facts. They said, hey, look at this data. Don't you want to have a secure retirement? And for the most part, this didn't have any impact. People didn't start saving for retirement. They didn't change their contribution rates. People did call the financial advisor line with licensed financial, and they asked questions like, how do I log into my account? I forgot my password. So our job to find out what was going on. We surveyed hundreds of people in our audience, did deep dive discussions with dozens, and we learned that we needed to ask different questions. It wasn't so useful to ask what people knew. That is important, sure, knowledge is important, but first we had to understand what people feel. Over and over, people said things like this: saving for retirement is very important to people. So important, in fact, that all of those facts and knowledge had actually become part of the problem. We found that people, by and large, viewed saving for retirement as an overwhelmingly complex endeavor. There are so many options with little details that are possible to keep track of, which means people see wrong choices at every turn. The complexity is then contextualized by messaging that stresses the importance of saving for retirement. Messages like, start saving now, or you'll regret it. This decision has life or death consequences. Don't mess up. Also, here are 50 different investment packages with small differences. Good luck choosing one. It turns out that this kind of context produces a lot of strong emotions. Remember that our emotions are information from us to us for the express purpose of decision making. So when you're in a high stakes situation and you become overwhelmed by the complexity of that situation, and you've therefore lost control of your circumstances, Emotions like confusion, like doubt, like fear, like anxiety, these emotions pop up and strongly inform you that you should decide to flee. You should get out, you should disengage. And if you do disengage, these uncomfortable emotions subside, they go away, they did their job, you're safe now. If you don't disengage from the situation, these emotions continue or worsen. Because remember that for the vast majority of cases in life and for the vast majority of human history, when the stakes are high, when the situation is really just chaos, when you've actually lost control, when you can't see a clear way through, the healthy choice is to leave. It's to run away from the wolves, to go away from the fire, to get away from danger. The human brain is designed to get us out of these situations. So let's look at this from a game design perspective. This means I'm going to make a chart now. In fact, as game designers and game developers yourselves, many of you may already be familiar with a chart that looks something like this. Let's, on the x-axis, chart the complexity of an experience. So simple, more passive experiences on the left, complicated stuff that requires lots of active attention to decipher on the right. And on the y-axis, let's put the severity of consequences. At the top, maximum consequences. At the bottom, no consequences. We know we can use these levers, these axes, to create different kinds of game experiences. So low complexity and low consequences, we've got relaxed fun. High complexity and high consequences, we have this like intense fun. And in the middle, I don't have a cool name for it, balanced fun, I don't know. These are all great, valid forms of fun in different contexts for different people, even in that intense area, right? Pro sports are really intense because the stakes are really high, careers are on the line, but the games are really well understood by players. They don't change that much that often. So they're still in this intense zone. Video games might push the limit by being really hard, really challenging, but maybe they provide lots of feedback so players can feel like they're improving. We know how to make games, we know how to keep games in these zones. And the reason we work so hard to keep games in these zones is because we know there's a line there, there's a line on this graph where players will start to bounce off of the game and disengage. If the stakes ever get too high and or the game becomes too complex at the same time, the experience becomes overwhelming. Players experience confusion, doubt around their own abilities, frustration due to a lack of control. They experience fear and anxiety. And as you may have experienced in game dev, players who feel like this stop playing. So we avoid that. We design to make sure that for our target player base, we don't become overwhelming. The problem is the real world isn't as kindly designed. Financial systems are often extremely complicated and the impact on our lives, very high stakes. Healthcare choices and decisions in the United States especially, can be overwhelming. I haven't done formal research on this, but I'd be willing to bet that the ongoing existential threat of our climate crisis is generally going to be perceived to be overwhelming by a moderately well-informed individual. So that's one of our major challenges as humans and as designers who want to make a positive impact, right? All of my experience and all of my research, all my reading has told me that progressive action is not possible when you're overwhelmed. It's simply not possible. This means one way we can be really helpful as designers is to help reframe these problems and shift people out of this overwhelmed space. We can validate their feelings gently. We can acknowledge that, yeah, this is a big problem with big consequences and it is complicated. Come this way and let's work through it together. Maybe you focus on removing consequences. So here's a complicated simulation of the climate crisis, but no worries, it's an imaginary simulated world with no people in it. Go wild, move the sliders, cool. Maybe you focus on removing complexity. So like, hey players, let's start small and focused and only increase complexity as you get comfortable. We can make an impact one step at a time. And this goes for you too, by the way, right? You can make an impact on players one step at a time. It doesn't have to be all at once. So remember my story about the financial institution that couldn't get young adults to engage with investing or saving for retirement. Our solution was a game that shifted the problem out of this overwhelming space. We found their emotions and we handled them gently. So we started with content that was low in complexity and low in stakes and game environment very removed from reality, and we slowly increased the intensity. By the end of the game, players didn't see their real world investment choices as overwhelming anymore. We empowered players and reframed the problem. We couldn't lower the stakes in the end. It's still a big choice with big impact on your life, but we could address the perceived complexity. So players were now confident enough to learn more on their own, to face the problem in real life, to engage, and to save for retirement. As a review, fear, anxiety, frustration, strong confusion, these feelings of being overwhelmed contribute to a strong impulse to disengage. So avoid experiences that depend on these feelings to inspire change. When you're aiming to impact users who feel overwhelmed, I recommend you carefully consider how you present complexity and consequences in order to avoid overwhelming players, and aim to foster confidence and hope and optimism instead, so you can leave them in a less overwhelmed state than you may have found them. Something to consider while I take a drink of water: how might you tune the complexity and consequences in your game to keep players feeling empowered rather than overwhelmed, even as you guide them to face a large, potentially scary real world? Okay, water break over. Part 2, shaping identity. I've found that connecting emotionally is a great approach to use when I want to design an experience that leads to an action. If I say, after playing this game, players will make a budget, or walk 10,000 steps, or recycle when moving homes, or plant a tree, awesome. We can design a game where players build towards that action, complete that action, and feel good about having accomplished something real. That's great. If we want behavior change that's sustained, though, we need to take our connection a step further, I've found, and understand that sustained behavior change really requires a change in chosen identity. I'm specifying chosen here in terms of chosen identity because I want to acknowledge that identity is a huge multifaceted topic, and obviously there are aspects of identity that can be more inherent to a person. Today I'm focused on the ones we take on for ourselves. Like on dating apps, this would be the section where we free write text, like, hi, I'm Trevin, and I'm fluent in sarcasm. Okay. I did not come up with this idea of chosen identity, obviously. We can just look to the marketing world, to brands and to product designers, and see how powerful a force identity can be. If Disney can market a movie well enough to tug on your emotions so that you pay to view it, they're pretty happy. But they're way happier if they can get you to identify as, say, a Marvel fan. Because now you're gonna see just about every Marvel movie, aren't you? And if they strengthen that identity, maybe you also watch the shows and you play the games. Similarly, they're happy if they inspire you to visit Disneyland. But if they can convince you to become a Disney family, they're much happier about that. And they spend a lot of effort making this seem like an appealing and welcoming identity to adopt. There's some serious levels to this. On family.disney.com, I found this: in case it's important to you to name your child after a Disney character, Disney is here for you on every step of your identity journey. Like I mentioned, this isn't just a brand thing. I really like this book titled Badass by Kathy Sierra, who's an author and designer of many things, including games. She points out that products benefit from similar efforts to build an identity. So for example, from the book, a camera maker shouldn't aim to turn people into camera owners. It should aim to turn people into photographers. The identity leads to a lifetime of engagement. And if you're thinking, maybe it might be problematic in some contexts to foster strong identities around brands and products, then I hear those thoughts and I would tend to agree. My point today, though, is to recognize how powerful this existing dynamic is. So if we can impact identity for a good cause, that might be worth a shot. And luckily for us, this dynamic has been pretty well studied outside of brands and products also. So let's look at a different example from a different angle. Let's look at fitness. Let's consider this guy, James, who isn't happy with his health. He might decide, I want to lose weight. And he pursues the paths towards his goal that he sees. So he finds a diet and he starts a workout program. And if he's like most people in his situation, it works at first. He loses a little weight, he gets a little more fit, And then his diet slips, right? He stops working out so much. The weight comes back. He gets discouraged. He gives up for now. Losing weight is a measurable goal, and clear measurable goals are useful parts of sustained behavior change. And for some people, maybe his plan would have worked. But diets and new workout programs are large life changes, and it's simply very hard to sustain those kinds of changes. It requires a lot of energy, a lot of willpower energy. So what if the next time James decides he wants to do something about his health, the story goes a different way? James isn't happy with his health. He thinks he wants to lose weight, but a friend helps him reframe his goal. Become a healthy person. Now James's goal is an identity shift. Identity shifts are powerful because they remove a lot of that cognitive resistance, a lot of that willpower cost from changing your behavior. If I'm a Marvel fan, of course I'm going to see the new Avengers movie. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to spend the energy to make that decision. If James wants to identify as a healthy person, of course, then he regularly exercises. It's what healthy people do. This time, instead of trying a diet and failing, James slowly but steadily perhaps adds more vegetables to his meals and removes processed sugar because he reads that this is what healthy people do. And eventually, unconsciously, he's completed his identity transformation because he's realized he's been behaving like a healthy person. He no longer is trying to become one. He's practicing it. He's doing it. And that provides the evidence he needs to fully identify as a healthy person. He eats healthily, he exercises healthily, and these behaviors aren't going to go away easily. It would require an identity shift to do that. What's really cool, what I think is really cool about this is that as long as he's provided with safe, trusted sources of information, he gets to define what healthy means for himself. A person who decides to become a healthy version of themselves might end up losing weight like James, or they might end up gaining weight. They might end up building muscle. They might end up running a marathon. They might simply end up being able to get through a day with less back pain. Chosen identities can come in so many different individual shapes and sizes tied together by that shared approach to life. Outcomes do happen, but now the focus is on the process. And it turns out this is exactly where we want the focus to be when achieving the outcome is going to take a long time or be really hard to measure or not always be a pleasant experience. Like, for example, when the outcomes involve the planet. So how do we use this in games? You know, of course, obviously, that games give players identities all the time, right? There's whole genres about this. If we want to make a lasting impact on player identity after the game is over, I found the key to be pretty straightforward. Be upfront about connecting the identity to a real world context and make the actual gameplay experience validate the identity so that when the player moves from the game to the real world, they feel like they've earned this identity. And then finally, connect players from that game back to the real world once they're done playing. I'll give you a couple of examples, and I'll start by pointing out that there might be times when you want to invent an identity to package a set of values and attitudes and behaviors. Community organizers do this all the time. For example, according to their website, a Girl Scout is a girl of courage, confidence, and character who makes the world a better place. To the extent a Girl Scout leaves the program understanding how to live these values, how to apply them in a real world context, their life is going to continue to be shaped by that identity, unless at some point that identity fades or changes. In a couple of weeks, a game I'm designing with an org named Trackhead is going to launch at Zoo Tampa in Florida. Zoo Tampa wanted an experience that leaves kids valuing an empathetic connection to animals and leaves kids committed to supporting animal conservation efforts. So we made a game about becoming a wildlife explorer, which is an identity we made up that we defined as a person who is a friend to animals, committed to helping them however they can. Using wearable tech, the kids and their families explore the zoo. They interact with animals. They help solve the animals' problems. They earn the animals' trust. They learn animal secrets. And as they go on this adventure through the zoo, the park staff validate their identity as wildlife explorers. The park staff will see them and thank them for helping the animals today. And at the end of the day, the kids who complete the game get physical badges to mark them as wildlife explorers. This experience leaves them with an identity that we gave them, but we shaped it with them, right? We also gave them knowledge concerning how to support conservation efforts. We gave them a day practicing behaviors that validates this identity. So to review, sustained behavior change really requires identity change. Luckily, games shape identity. So if you can connect player identity to a real world identity with specific clear examples, if you can have gameplay model appropriate behavior to build evidence for that identity, this can be a really effective pathway. Something to consider while I drink more water. How might you map the existing ways players solve problems in your game to real world positive role model identities, to real world identities? Okay, next up. This brings us to trust. There are two big barriers to change that can be rooted in trust, and I'm going to address the simpler one first. Sometimes players want to make a positive impact in their lives or in their world, and they don't trust themselves to be able to do that. They don't believe they can make a difference. This problem can often be related to a problem I described earlier, where a person might be overwhelmed by a situation and then want to disengage. If this is true for your players, you can help by getting them to believe in themselves. It sounds maybe trite, maybe hokey, but it's true. And addressing this looks a lot like what you're already doing in games. Building trust within players means offering clear, actionable goals in the game, validating and celebrating the player's achievement when they accomplish these goals, ramping up difficulty smoothly so the player gets to experience and feel their own growing mastery, supporting social connections between players so they don't feel like they're alone in their efforts. You may be doing some or all of these already. I'm sure you are, because you're building engaging games that foster a player's intrinsic motivation. This means you're already good at getting players to trust that they can make a difference within your game. So the next step is just to connect the dots between trust in the games and their trust in their own ability to impact the real world. This might look like an experience that gradually lets go of the player and transitions into the real world instead of just dropping off with a sharp game over, great job, get out there. When players have finished with your game, put the next action they should take directly in the game, if possible. And if possible, validate and celebrate them when they take that action and help them realize the impact of their actions. And even better, if you can, help them connect to the community of players who are also trying to make an impact in the real world to keep that community moving forward into the real world. I'll give you an example. One of the games I worked on was aimed at people who had lost faith in their ability to make healthy long-term investment decisions. We made a game about this, and once players finished the game, we asked them to take their lesson into the real world. The game offered a button at the end of a single playthrough, or at the end of every playthrough, that directly brought them to the web page where they could take an action, where they could set their retirement saving schedule. Players reported that the game gave them the confidence they needed to take an action, so this was a great time to give them that push. And this is not even a big button. It says learn more under a little bit of text that connects whatever their gameplay decisions were to the real world. And we had a 32% click-through rate after 20 minutes of gameplay. We doubled the outcomes of any of our partner financial institutions' previous efforts to direct people towards action. And so this works. And that's the relatively simple challenge with trust. The harder challenge is when we want to connect to people who might not trust us or who might not trust us in this context. These are the harder questions. How might we reach and empower a person to achieve financial security if they're completely unbanked, because the only place they trust to put their money is under their mattress? How might we reach and aid a family struggling to find appropriate healthcare support if they don't trust science? How might we help a person read the climate exists if they don't trust that it does? I don't have any personal projects used as examples here, not anything I can share yet. But I actively that games can contribute massively to this context. And so I'm thinking about ways to design the space. And I'm hungry to learn about other people's efforts within this space. So here are my two on this matter. Trevin's thoughts. One, it's useful to remember that all knowledge is dependent on trust. I have directly observed very little of what I would say I know. For example, I've not been to Madagascar. Cartographers could be lying. I've never actually seen anyone skydive and then land safely with my own eyes. Grant here told me he's done it, but if I didn't trust him, I'm not sure I would have convinced myself it was possible. Here's a classic example. You can raise your Zoom hand if you've been to outer space and can directly report from firsthand experience that the world is indeed a sphere. If you haven't seen it with your own eyes, and nobody's raised their hand, so nobody has, how do we know that it's round? Well, we know in the same way that we know most things. People we trust told us so. And as we grew up and as we expanded our circles of trust, we collectively developed a shared, useful, healthy understanding of what goes on in our lives. Knowledge depends on trust in our communities. And this brings me to my second thought. Your players trust you. Most of you are here because you have existing games with existing player bases. You have existing audiences. You have existing communities. Your players trust you, and you know this, right? They must trust you or they wouldn't be your players. You have an opportunity now that I've never had in any of my projects. You have an opportunity to further connect with people you're already connected with. You have an opportunity to nudge, to shift, to expand your players' understanding of the world's problems and their ability to make a difference. And you have this opportunity simply because they already know you. Of course, you have to treat this trust with care. Of course, treat it with respect. Handle it responsibly. As you bring large, real-world problems to your players, be gentle with their feelings, be respectful of their goals, be supportive of their efforts as they learn to make a difference together with you. But if you can do that, I truly believe your games can and will be transformational forces for good. So that's it. It's emotions, identity, and trust. That's what I think about when I design games intended for transforming players. This is what I've got so far in my career, but I know I'm just getting started. I have so much to learn, I know, alongside all of you, and I sincerely look forward to the results of all of your efforts during the Spring Game Jam. I look forward to learning from the approaches you found to work best with your audiences in the context of your games. I look forward to all of that. For now, thanks so much for your time. We have plenty of time for questions, 20 minutes, I think. Before I open up for questions, I'm sure not the first person to mention this, so, but redundancy is good, right? If you haven't already, check out the IGDA Climate SIG. I found it to be a community full of wonderful, brilliant, welcoming people thinking through how games can be a positive force during the climate crisis. And you can also contact me if you want to with questions. If you think of a question later, you can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter or through my website, trevinyork.com. Question time.
Thank you so much, Trevin. That was great. And yes, please feel free to ask questions either in the chat or just unmute yourselves and throw them out.
Yeah, also from my side, thank you very much. It was great to listen.
Thank you so much for saying that. I know I went over a lot of things, and it really is okay if somebody thinks of a question later. Again, you can just contact me and I'll be happy to answer.
Hi, Trevin. Good talk. I wanted to ask about, so the financial game that you demonstrated, I understood, like, so you created it, you got people in, they engaged with it, and then you offered the opportunity to go out and actually do the investment or learn more in a sort of structured, easy to learn way. But how did you get players into the game to begin with? How did you start that relationship?
That's a fantastic question, and it's changed based on context. We've had Mindblown has released. I've worked on 3 games with Mindblown in the financial space. One of them was targeted towards teens and young adults, and those were introduced through the classroom. So we provided like blended learning support, and we got kids to start playing because they were told to, but we couldn't get them to finish because they were told to, obviously. In order to do that, we had to make sure the game was fun and engaging. But getting them started in that case involved a teacher. In terms of the couple of games that we released for young adults in the workforce, that was really a concern of finding the people at the moment they most felt overwhelmed. In this case, it was generally when they started a new job and went through the HR onboarding process, and they had to make all these decisions about their benefits packages, or they had just moved and had to make decisions, or had to make new financial decisions. So one of them was directly delivered as part of HR onboarding processes, and another one was used as it was just generally given to newer hires, not directly during the HR onboarding process, but given to new hires. We recontextualized a couple of these games. Last summer, I mentioned we ran a virtual camp. And in that case, we just said, hey, if you feel like you need more support in these areas, sign up for these camps and we'll give you these games and also give you some support and supporting information. And in that case, people just signed up and showed up for like 1 or 2 weeks, depending on the program. And throughout that time, this whole community of people was playing the game together, cohort by cohort. Did that answer the question?
Yes, brilliant, thank you.
Cool. I got a question in the chat, which is, which of these games are accessible for you to play so you can experience firsthand these principles? Yeah, so great question. Luckily, because of the program we ran last summer, some of our older games have been remastered for modern mobile devices. So Thrive and Shine, I'll type it in the chat, by Mindblown Labs, is on iOS and Android devices. And that's probably the most accessible one right now, actually, which is a game centered around personal finance and budgeting. It's been successful, really successful, like for like 10-year-olds, but adults say they also have enjoyed it. That's a good primer. Yeah, that's the most accessible one. Like I said, one of the projects we'll be launching at Zoo Tampa in a few weeks. That's the one that's not finances. That's one's about conservation efforts. So if you have a family and after you're safely vaccinated, you want to hang out at the zoo and experience that, that should be accessible soon. Question from Grant. Do you have any examples of how you measured the impact of learnings you had on players? Let me re-say that question. It's a good question. Do you have any examples of how you measured the impact you had on players? Yeah. So for the first game I mentioned, Thrive and Shine, the US Treasury sponsored an independent evaluation. And that was a massive randomized control trial. And that has pros and cons. The pro is that you get theoretically more robust evidence. I would not recommend starting there because it's slow and it takes a long time and there's a lot of parts where it can fail. Part of that study, in fact, didn't go as smoothly as we'd hoped. The people who collected one kind of data didn't properly collect it. So hopefully we'll do another one, I guess. It's more lighter weight stuff that you can get, that you can more elegantly integrate into game production practices, is to run pre and post tests, in a sense, when you do trials or pilot programs, or even just like play tests. Sometimes for future tense and another project, those are the ones aimed at adults, we would, at the beginning of a play test, have them fill out like a 5-question questionnaire. And it was like 5 questions on knowledge and like 5 questions on behavior, I think. And then at the end of the pilot or the end of the playtest, we would have them fill out the same thing, and we would measure change in attitudes and behaviors and knowledge. in future tense, eventually we added some of that assessment directly into the game. So you'd have a character that came up and at the beginning of the game and asked you for advice. And then we'd have a different character ask you for similar advice later in the game. And players' answers changed. Like the way players were interacting with this character changed, because by the time they got to the second character, they had changed what they thought, like their confidence, and changed their understanding of what behaviors were appropriate for these contexts. I think ideally assessing in the game is going to be a more elegant experience for the player, but it also, is more expensive to set up and harder to change on the fly. So there are trade-offs. Good questions. I'm going to drink more water.
I have a question while we're waiting for more questions as well. You were saying that there are different ways that we can affect our players. One is through like a specific call to action that links them to something directly, and the other one is helping them to create an identity. For example, I am now someone who cares about the environment, or I am an environmentally friendly person, or I don't know what that identity would be exactly. Yeah. Do you think that we should be aiming for both sort of at the same time? Do you think there's one that she'll be aiming for in short term while keeping the other in mind for the long term? Like, is one more powerful than the other? What's the sort of balance of attack there, I guess?
Again, great question. I've found in my experience that in your ideal, you're going to be thinking about both. You want to think about the long-term identity you're building towards, and you're thinking about the short-term action to start the player, the person, building evidence towards that identity, because that identity in the real world only becomes real once you start behaving like it. Also, if you have engagement fall off, then at least you've gotten people to start that road, and maybe they circle back in 5 years, like later in their life, and they remember that one thing they did, the time they planted a tree, and they think on it fondly. Like, their timeline might not fit your timeline. So by getting them to do a short-term action, you're at least starting them on that journey. While again, ideally, you're thinking about the long-term. Now, the caveat to that is that the more focused you are on the impact you want to have, the more successful you're likely to be, especially in the short term. If you're making a new project to have a specific impact, the more specific of your impact, the quicker you're going to be able to succeed in getting that. Because making games is hard, and making games to have a specific impact adds another layer of complexity. You're going to have to go through a lot of the same kind of design iteration processes to play test and check for impact and learn and grow and iterate and reshape your game in order to be effective. So if you're right away committing to like a measuring behavior change 2 years out, now your iteration timeline is really long. So it helps to have a shorter goal in mind first.
Thanks. That's really helpful.
Cool.
Hey Trevin, thank you so much for this talk. It was really inspiring. I was wondering, you probably had a lot of ideas of how to apply all those principles in a game for climate. Would you mind sharing some of those ideas with us?
Yeah, no problem. I think there's a version of this answer which might be more direct, where I say, oh, you could do X, Y, Z, and then they plant a tree and it rhymes. And that's not honestly how I approach these kinds of projects. I start bigger picture and then zoom in. And I think that generally is like a best practice. So that was really abstract to me. Let me get a little bit more specific than that. Whenever we start a project to have a specific impact on a specific group of people, we think about who we want to impact first. That's number one. What community are we connecting with? Now, in contexts like the Green Game Jam, you have community of your players, you have an existing community, but that's the place where you start. You understand who they are, where they are in life, what are their commonalities, what are their differences, what's the scope of that community? Where are they in life? What ways might they have an impact on the climate, specifically to them? not specific to the general population, but specific to that community. And then you might start by I might start by talking to them and saying, hey, how do you currently feel about this? What are your current attitudes about this? Are you skeptical of the climate crisis? Are you overwhelmed by it? Are you interested in taking an action but just don't know what to do next? That's going to depend based on the community. So once we have that focus, once we have that information, we would then design we would then make design decisions to identify, we would then identify the specific impact we want to have, right? So we know where they are now, and we then decide where we want them to go. And then we make design decisions to bridge that gap. We know where they are, we know where we want them to go, and we're gonna make choices in our game to have them get there. So to be more specific next, we would, let me think of like a specific example. Let's say we had a community of people that was generally aware of the climate crisis and they wanted to help, but they felt like they couldn't. They felt like they didn't have a way to make an impact. And they felt like nothing they could do would be enough to matter. And we want to get them to a place where they feel empowered and confident enough to take an action in the real world, where they can feel, where they can actually, yes, have a benefit, make an impact, and they can feel like they made an impact, and they can be set up for a future identity as someone who is ready and willing to keep participating in things like this. So we might make a game experience that is emotionally connected to that story, it's emotionally connected to that arc. And the theming could be a whole lot of different things, but the mechanic might be something around a giant system where you can only really do one action or a small action or one or two small actions. And the game is about taking these one or two small actions and seeing how that action, one or two action can have a big impact, or you and a community of people can do one or two small actions. And then you collectively see how that has a bigger impact on the system to build confidence and trust that small actions can add up and have an impact. And that might be the emotional arc of the mechanics of the game. And then maybe we increase complexity and like get a little bit more specific over time. And at the end, we leave them with direct information on how and where and when to go plant that tree in the real world and connect it back to the experiences they just went through in the game. Hey, you just did this whole experience about how your small actions added up to a bigger, larger impact. Let's do it. Let's do that in the real world now. You just did this. Let's just do it in a physical space. I hope that answered your question.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Okay, cool.
That's a really good
I need
point.
more
That
water.
really, oh, sorry, that really connects well with Arnaud's talk this morning as well, you know, sort of trying to get us to look at the games that we have already created that aren't necessarily just about climate or just about, you know, green themes, but what's present within those games already that we can maybe use to get players to think about things differently, or like what are the tools that we've already armed our players with that could be useful in this context. So I think that's a really, really great connection, actually.
Yeah, I love how that fits together. That's brilliant.
Trevin, I've got a question.
Yeah.
What do you think, how big is the impact of the actions you take outside the game? So let's say on social media, or you build a landing page for this specific feature, or the design feature you have for the green topics. How big is the how much does it support the game or the action for the player to experience this?
I'm not sure I fully understand your question. Are you asking, aside from the in-game efforts, how do the discussion, marketing, and community organizing around the game experience, like what does that look
Yes.
like? Was that
Yes.
your question? Oh,
Yes,
okay.
yes, exactly.
That is going to vary based on the energy you put into it. I think the key there for me that I think about ties back to what I mentioned about how trust is really centered in community. And by building a community that's already persistent around a game, you can help foster and spread that trust. And that's how trust in systems ebbs and it's how it increases and decreases. When half of your friends are doing something, you're much more likely to do it. When none of your friends are doing something, you're much less likely to participate. And that's the kind of snowbally momentum that I see as really impactful in the discussions and marketing and stuff around a game. So you get an effect where even players that don't, even people that don't play the game, maybe they've had friends that have played it and have talked to them about it. There's going to be secondary effects. If like 10 of my friends have played this game, even if I never get to, now I have this portion of my circle of trust that is armed with this knowledge and behaviors. Maybe they wrote me into planting the tree, even though I didn't play the game. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Oh, thank you. There's such nice notes in the comments.
Most people are nice.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. No, everybody in this group is great. Are there any last minute burning questions for Trevin?
I have maybe one question.
For it.
Something, because there's a couple of people from Wooga here and we're like internally chatting on Slack and sharing good words on the presentation. And
oh, thank you.
Thinking about like building trust or having trust with a community of players that we've built up. Can you share anything around how we can think more of not breaking that trust? Because I think a lot of our players are playing to kind of like move away from real time or real world issues, escape from what's going on in the world. But then we want to like bring in this very appealing real world question. How do we make sure that we don't break that trust and be like, okay, this is a good provider of information around the climate or the climate change or what's happening, or I can learn something from that, but I still want to make sure that I play my game and I get happy from doing that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. As I mentioned during the presentation, I don't have direct experience with your exact situation and that I've never adapted a game with an existing player base. However, I have made games with and like on the behalf of giant organizations that are extremely concerned about their existing relationship with their customers or clients or users, and they asked basically the same question, right? How do we build on this relationship without damaging this relationship, even as we're asking people to change something, which can be a tough thing to ask. So from that standpoint, from that context, I've thought about this a lot. And the answer I've arrived at so far is that it's simpler than you might think. And by that, I mean, you can ask, the way I frame it is, how might I have this discussion with a friend who trusts me? What am I going to do with them? And what am I absolutely going to avoid doing? I'm going to avoid surprising them. I'm going to avoid putting them in situations they did not ask to be in. I'm going to avoid springing discussions on them. I am going to invite them to try stuff. I'm going to invite them to ask questions. I'm going to invite them to participate in an experience. I'm going to sell it to them. I'm going to pitch them. I'm going to be like, hey, this is fun. This is engaging. I think this is important to me. I think that you would enjoy this. I think you would benefit from this, but I'm not going to be like, show up to a friend's birthday party and be like, surprise, this is actually a climate change discussion now. Context matters, right? And that relationship, I constantly think about it as, how might I handle this with a friend? Because we're all humans interacting through this design space, and treat them with respect and let them offer consent to participate. And if they get frustrated, I talked about validating their feelings. And when I say it's simpler than you might think, when you think of it through that lens, I feel like it's hard to go wrong. Because even if you mess up, like people make mistakes with friends, you're there in a position where you can say, oh, you're right, I hear you, I apologize, let's adjust.
Yeah, fair enough. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Cool. I'm glad.
Thank you so much. We are at time. If you do have more questions for Trevin, of course, he's left us his contact info. If you happen to have missed it, feel free to ping me as well, and I can connect you to Trevin. I know he's more than happy to answer any questions as you're also designing your ideas and concepts, etc. If you want to run something by him, like he's happy to do that. I think, right? Yes. I didn't just offer that up without
that's
checking
right.
with you. Yeah, cool. I assumed from the conversations we had that was okay. But yeah, our
That's
next chat will be on Thursday, where we have some of the class of 2020 from the Jam sharing what they did and some of the challenges they might have run into, etc. Some of the learnings. So come along to that on Thursday. Tomorrow we've got a break. Yeah. So join us on Thursday. But thank you so much, Trevin. That was great. And yes, we will share the slides and the recording for all the talks.
Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for your wonderful questions.